Good evening, friend. This is the Night Watch. I'm Frank. I have the watch tonight. You don't have to. Every episode is one true night from history, told slow enough to fall asleep to. So pull up your covers, turn off your light, close your eyes, and let the story drift you off tonight. The last night of June, 1520, on a city built in the middle of a lake. It's the first hour of full dark on the 30th of June in the year 1520, and I'm standing on a causeway 2 miles long that runs straight out across open water toward a city with no ground under it. My name is Frank. I have the watch tonight. You don't have to. I'll tell you the shape of the night before we start, because you and I don't keep secrets at this hour. Before morning, an army that has been living inside this city as a guest is going to try to leave it in the dark and in the rain. And this causeway is the road they'll take, and it will not go well for them. History gave the night a name afterward. The people who wrote that name were the ones who lost. But here's what I want you to hold, and I'll prove every piece of it before dawn. The city under my feet does not end tonight. Not tonight. It's still there. This exact minute, 5 centuries on, under a different name. 20 million people deep. You could stand where I'm standing tomorrow. There's a street over it. So drift off whenever you like. The watch stays lit either way. That's the arrangement. That's always been the arrangement. Come out along the causeway with me. Mind your footing. The stone's wet most nights. Let me show you where we are, because almost nobody gets this part right. Below the causeway on both sides is water. Not a moat, not a river. A lake, a shallow silver-brown lake filling a whole mountain valley, and sitting in the middle of it, an island, and standing on the island, a city. Its name is Tenochtitlan. It has been here about 200 years, which is to say, it was founded within living memory of your great-great-grandparents' great-great-grandparents. And in that time it has become one of the largest cities on Earth. Not one of the largest in this hemisphere. On Earth. There may be 200,000 people asleep out there tonight. London, at this same moment, has perhaps 50,000. And smells considerably worse. The lake is the reason for all of it. The city grows its food on the water in long rectangular garden plots, staked into the lake bed, black mud and reeds, so fertile they harvest several times a year. It moves everything by canoe, which is why the streets out there are half stone and half water. And it defends itself with the same lake, because an island is a fortress that grows its own dinner. 3 causeways connect it to the mainland. 3. That's the whole list of ways in or out by foot. I'm standing on one of them. Now, who I am, since we'll be out here together all night. I keep a bridge post. That needs explaining, and it's the single most important thing I'll tell you tonight. So let's take it slowly. The causeways aren't solid. That's on purpose. Every so often, along their length, the builders left a gap, a clean cut straight through the roadway from one side to the other, open water below. Over each gap goes a wooden bridge, and the bridges are not nailed down. They lift out. Think about what that means for a moment. In peacetime, you walk to the mainland dry-shod and never think about it. In trouble, the city pulls its bridges, and the causeway becomes a row of stone islands with water between them, and whatever is standing on it is standing there for good. A city that can pick up its roads. My post is one gap, one bridge, and one job. Watch the water, watch the road, and know which of those two things the bridge should be doing. 49 nights in 50, the answer is nothing at all, and I stand here listening to the lake move. Tonight is not one of the 49. Look east with me before the weather closes in, because you should see this city while it's whole and lit, and because the view is the reason people who saw it never shut up about it afterward. From out here at night, Tenochtitlan is a low, dark mass on the water with lights on it. Thousands of small fires and torches doubled in the lake, so the whole thing sits in a smear of its own reflection. The causeways run out from it in 3 straight lit lines. Canoes cross those lines all night. Little moving sparks. Above everything, at the center, there's a stepped pyramid with 2 shrines on top, and both shrines keep fires burning, so the highest thing in the valley is a pair of flames sitting on a stair of shadow. One of the men currently inside that city, a Spanish soldier named Bernal Diaz, will write about his first sight of this place when he's an old man, decades from tonight. And he'll say his companions asked each other whether what they were seeing was real or a dream. He'll write that some of the soldiers had seen Rome and Constantinople, and that this was better. Hold that. The man who says it is going to spend tonight running for his life, away from it. Listen now. This is the part I love, and it's the part that will start everything later. The city keeps time, out loud, all night, every night. Up on the temple platforms, there are priests whose entire job is the night. They don't sleep when you sleep. They watch the stars cross. They tend the fires. And at intervals through the dark, they sound the hours. Conch trumpets, a long, low note that carries across water better than any bell, and drums. And there's one great drum up there, with a voice you feel in the causeway stone under your boots. So the night out here is not silent. It's marked. Every so often, the dark says a number. And every watchman on every causeway, me included, learns the pattern the way you learn a clock in a hallway. You stop hearing it. It becomes the sound of nothing being wrong. Which means that when the pattern breaks, when a note comes at the wrong hour, or comes too fast, or comes from a platform that shouldn't be calling, every single person on this water knows it instantly, without being told, in the first half second. Remember that. It's going to matter around midnight. There's weather coming in tonight, and I'd write it in the log if the log were mine to write. It's the end of June, which here is the beginning of the wet season, when the valley gets its rain in the afternoons and evenings, and the mornings come up washed. Tonight the cloud has stayed low, and there's a fine drizzle starting, the kind that doesn't fall so much as hang, and it's turning the causeway stone dark and slick, and taking the edges off every light in the city. Good sleeping weather, honestly. Cool, soft, steady. If you're drifting already, that's the rain doing its work, and I'd not fight it. For a watchman, though, rain is a mixed blessing. It muffles sound, which is bad. It kills reflections on the water, which is worse. Because half of what I do out here is read the lake for the shape of a canoe that shouldn't be there. And it does one more thing that will matter a great deal in about 4 hours. Wet timber is heavy, wet rope swells, and wet stone under a running man is a promise he can't keep. That's the night's weather. Hold it in your ear. Soft rain on a wide, flat lake, and somewhere off in the dark, a drum saying the hour. One more thing while it's quiet, and then I'll tell you how we got here, because you're owed the how. Look back along the causeway toward the city, at the buildings crowded near the shore. There's a large, walled compound in there, an old palace that belonged to a ruler named Axayacatl, and it has been full of foreigners since November. Not a few. Hundreds. Men with steel, horses, and guns who walked in as guests 8 months ago, were housed, fed, and shown the city, and then made themselves something else. They're in there right now, tonight, behind barricades, and the city is standing around them in the dark. I want to be careful about how I tell you the next hour, because this is the part where every version you may have heard goes strange. Some tellings make those men in the palace into monsters. Some make them into heroes. They were neither. They were mostly young, mostly poor, a long way from home, badly frightened, and led by a man who kept making decisions that only made sense if he never intended to leave. And the people around them, my people, the ones standing in the rain out there tonight, were not a mob, and were not a backdrop. They were a functioning city that had made a decision. That's the honest version, Let's walk back and see how both sides got here. It starts, as these things do, on a coast, and it starts about a year and a half ago. A fleet lands on the eastern shore in the spring of 1519. 600-odd men, a handful of horses, some cannon, and a commander named Hernán Cortes, who begins his campaign by making sure his own men cannot leave, running his ships aground so nobody can sail home. That tells you the shape of him about as fast as anything can. They come inland. And here's the part the simple story leaves out. They do not conquer their way across a continent. They recruit. This valley's great power, the Triple Alliance we now call the Aztec Empire, rules by tribute, and tribute makes enemies. Cortes collects those enemies. By the time he arrives at this lake, the largest part of his force isn't Spanish at all. It's Tlaxcalan, from a nation that has been at war with this valley for generations. That matters tonight for a reason I'll come back to when the counting starts, and it will make me angry when I get there. So I'll warn you first. In November of 1519, that combined force comes up the southern causeway and is met, formally and in the open, by the ruler of this city. His name is Moctezuma, the second of that name. I'm going to tell you very little about what was in his head, because the truth is nobody knows, and every writer who claims to has an agenda. What's documented is what he did. He met them on the causeway, he spoke with them, and he brought them inside and housed them in his father's palace. People have spent 5 centuries calling that decision cowardice, or superstition, or fate. I'll offer the Watchman's read, which is duller and fits the evidence better. He was the ruler of a very large state, looking at a small, strange, well-armed embassy, backed by a large army of his own enemies. And he chose to bring them close and study them, rather than fight on open ground. It's not a mad decision. It's the decision a careful man makes. It didn't work. Within a week or so, they had made him a prisoner in his own city, while keeping up the appearance that he was not, which is a thing that can be done to a head of state for a surprisingly long time, if everyone finds the pretense useful. And for months, incredibly, the city held its temper. 8 months of foreigners in the palace, a hostage ruler, and a city choosing not to burn. The thing that ended it happened while Cortes wasn't even here. Cortes left in the spring, gone to the coast to deal with a Spanish force sent to arrest him. He left about 80 men in the city, under an officer named Pedro de Alvarado. In May, the city prepared for Tenochtitlan, one of the great festivals of the year. Nobles, priests, and dancers gathered in the temple precinct, unarmed, dressed for the ceremony. It was public. It was announced. The Spanish knew it was happening. Alvarado took his men into the precinct during the dancing and killed them. I'm going to leave it exactly there. You don't need the details, and I'm not going to give them to you. At this hour, they're in the record, and the record is enough. Both sides wrote it down. The Spanish who did it said afterward they feared an attack was being planned. The Mexica accounts describe unarmed celebrants and an enclosed courtyard. That is the hinge of everything. Not tonight, not the gold, not the rain. That afternoon in May, because after that, the city was finished pretending. It shut the market, it stopped the food, and it put the palace under siege, and it was still doing exactly that when Cortes came back in late June with more men and walked into a city that had already made up its mind. Third hour, friend, and the rain's steady. Sleep if it takes you. I'll keep the bridge. Cortes comes back up the southern causeway on the 24th of June with a good deal more than he left with. He'd gone to the coast to fight off a Spanish expedition sent to arrest him, and he did more than fight it off. He beat it, and then hired it. He talked the survivors into joining him, with the argument that has never once failed in the history of the world, which is that there was a great deal of gold where he was going. So, he returns to this lake with something like 1,300 Spaniards and a large body of Tlaxcalan allies, and he walks into a city that has stopped playing along. The market is shut. Nobody will sell them food. The causeway bridges, the ones like mine, are being lifted. The streets are quiet in the specific way streets get quiet when everyone in them has agreed on something and nobody has told you. He gets his people into the palace compound, and the city closes around it. Here's the part I'd underline if this were written down. He had a moment, right then, to turn around and go. The road was still behind him. He didn't. He went in. What follows is about a week of siege, and I'll describe it the way it would have sounded from out here, rather than the way it looked from inside, because from out here it sounded organized. The city didn't rush the walls in a mob. It worked. Crews took apart sections of causeway. Canoes moved fighters along the canals faster than anyone could walk. Attacks came in shifts. Pressure applied and eased and applied again, which is what you do when you have the numbers and time and your enemy has neither. Understand what the city was actually doing, tactically. It wasn't trying to storm a fortified compound full of guns and steel. That's expensive. It was doing the cheaper, smarter thing, cutting the roads, stopping the food, and waiting. A siege is a sum. The Spanish had no water source they controlled, no supply, and no way out that the city didn't own. The Spanish, for their part, made sorties, burned buildings, took towers. Diaz describes days of it, and the exhaustion in his account is real. He writes like a man who did not sleep for a week and never fully recovered from it. 2 armies, both competent, and only one of them could afford to be patient. Somewhere in that week, the ruler of this city died, and I have to tell you honestly that we don't know how. Here is what the Spanish wrote. They say they brought Moctezuma up onto a rooftop or terrace to speak to the crowd, to ask his people to stand down, and that his own people, furious with him, threw stones and darts, and that he was struck in the head and died of it a few days later, refusing treatment. Here is what the Mexica accounts say, written down decades later by elders who were young then. They say the Spanish killed him, that when he had stopped being useful as a shield, he was killed inside the compound along with other nobles, and the body was put out. Both of those accounts are self-serving in the direction you'd predict. The Spanish version makes his death the crowd's fault. The Mexica version makes it the invaders. Neither can be checked against the other. So, the watch does what the watch does. With a blank, it logs the blank. A ruler of one of the largest cities on earth died in the last week of June 1520 in his own capital in the hands of foreigners. And there are 2 stories and no way through. What isn't in doubt is what it cost the Spanish. The hostage was the whole plan. Once he was gone, they had nothing to bargain with, and no reason for the city to hesitate. The city, meanwhile, did something that people who tell this story quickly tend to skip. And it's the detail that changes the shape of the whole night. It elected a new ruler. His name was Cuitlahuac. He was Moctezuma's brother. He was the lord of Ixtapalapa, and he had been arguing against the foreigners from the start. The council chose him, and he took the office, and he took over the fight. Sit with that a second, because it undoes the version of this story most people carry. The city was not a leaderless mass, reacting in grief and rage. It had lost a head of state, held what amounted to an emergency succession in the middle of a siege, installed a new one with a known policy, and continued executing a plan. That's a functioning state under maximum stress, doing exactly what functioning states are supposed to do. And Cuitlahuac's plan was not complicated, which is usually the sign of a good one. Keep the roads cut, keep the food out, keep the pressure steady, let the lake do the arithmetic. It was working. By the last days of June, the men in that compound had run through their food, their water was bad, many were wounded, and their commander had finally arrived at the only conclusion available. They had to leave. and leaving was very nearly impossible, which is worth understanding properly. 3 causeways, every one of them cut in multiple places, bridges lifted, and every gap covered by canoes. Beyond the causeways, open lake for miles. The Spanish had no boats worth the name. They had built some earlier and the city had burned them. So, an army of a couple of thousand fighting men plus servants, allies, prisoners, horses, artillery, and a very large quantity of gold, needing to cross 2 miles of stone road with several holes in it, over deep water, through a city that owned the water. By daylight, it's not a plan, it's a casualty list. So the answer was the dark. They chose the western causeway, the one running to Tlacopan, which people now call Tacuba, because it was the shortest, about 2 miles to the mainland instead of 5 or 6, fewer gaps, less time exposed. And to solve the gaps, an engineer among them, a man named Martin Lopez, who had built the burned boats, built one portable bridge. One, a timber span they could carry, lay across a gap, run everyone over, then lift and carry to the next gap and do it again. Read that plan again with a watchman's eye. It works perfectly, as long as nothing goes wrong at the first gap. Before they moved, Cortes did the thing that this episode will keep coming back to, and I want to lay it out plainly and let it sit. He had the treasure brought out into the open, all of it. The gold that had been gathered over months, melted into bars, some of it worked pieces from the city and from the tribute stores. The crown's share, the royal fifth, was set aside and loaded onto a mare and onto the shoulders of some men detailed to it. That was the official portion, the part he'd have to account for. Then he told his men, in front of witnesses, that the rest was there and they should take what they wanted of it, since it would otherwise be left behind. Diaz, who was standing there, is very precise about what happened next. And he is precise because he lived and wanted the record straight. He says, the newest arrivals, the men who'd come with the expedition Cortes, had just absorbed, loaded themselves heaviest. They filled their clothes, their packs, their armor. And Diaz says he himself took only a few small pieces, a handful of jade, and got on with preparing to march. He wasn't being noble about it. He'd been in this valley long enough to know what 2 miles of wet stone and open water does to a man wearing his own body weight in metal. So here's the position as full dark comes down on the 30th of June. Inside the compound, somewhere over 1,000 Spaniards, several thousand Tlaxcalan allies, horses, guns they can't really move, wounded who can't really walk, prisoners including members of the city's ruling family, one portable bridge, and an unknowable weight of gold distributed across men according to how much each of them wanted it. Outside the compound, a city that has fought them to a standstill, cut every road, and has no reason at all to expect them to try to run tonight rather than any other night, between rain, getting steadier, And out here on the causeway, at my gap, with the bridge lifted and stacked and the water black underneath it, me doing what I do every night, which is nothing, in the dark, listening. Nobody in this valley knows what the next 6 hours are. Not the men in the palace, who think they have a plan. Not the city, which thinks it has time. Me. Not me. That's the honest condition of every night watch that ever mattered, friend. You never know which one it is until it's already happening. Let me give you the sound of it, because you may be close to sleep and this is the part worth taking with you. Rain on a lake makes almost no noise. That's the strange thing. Rain on a roof is loud. Rain on 200 square miles of shallow water is a hiss so even and so wide that after 10 minutes your ear files it as silence. So the night has a floor of soft nothing under everything else. On top of that, water moving against the causeway stones, a slow slap, irregular. Frogs, thousands of them, from the reed beds and the garden plots. Somewhere behind me, a dog. Somewhere ahead of me, another watchman coughing. One gap along, close enough to hear and too far to talk to. And at intervals, high and clear over all of it, from the temple platforms in the center of the city, the conch trumpets marking the hours of the night, and under them, the deep one, the great drum, which you feel through your boots before you hear it. That's the last quiet hour of the old city, friend. It's raining, the frogs are going, and the temple is counting. Sleep into it if you can. I'll wake you when the pattern breaks. They come out around midnight, and they come out quietly. And for a little while it works. Picture it from where I am, 2 miles out and looking back. Nothing. The compound gates open into a walled street, and the street is dark and the rain is doing what rain does to sound. No trumpets on their side, no drums, no torches held high. Men moving in column at a walk, in the wet, in the dark, with orders to say nothing. The order of march is sensible, which tells you a competent soldier laid it out. An advance party with the portable bridge and the men to work it. Then Cortes with the main body. Then the baggage, the guns, the prisoners, the treasure, the wounded. A rear guard under Pedro de Alvarado at the back, which is the worst job on the list, and everybody knew it. They get out of the compound. They get through the streets. They reach the head of the Tlacopan Causeway, where the city ends, and the stone road starts out across open water. And for a few hundred yards, this enormous, absurd, doomed procession moves along a causeway in the rain. And nobody in a city of 200,000 people knows they're there. It ends with a woman fetching water. That's the account. The Mexica sources say the alarm was raised by a woman who had gone out to the canal for water in the night and saw them and called out. Some versions add a priest on a temple platform who saw movement on the causeway and understood it. I like that it was somebody doing an ordinary chore at an unreasonable hour. It's the truest thing in the whole night. Empires turn on a person who couldn't sleep and went to get water. She calls, and here is where everything I told you about the temple hours pays off. Because the alarm doesn't have to travel by runner. It goes up to the platforms, and the platforms sound. And what comes off the top of the Great Pyramid is not the hour. It's the wrong note at the wrong time, held too long. And every single person on this lake sits up at once. I've been standing at this bridge post for hours, listening to nothing. I hear that note, and I am already moving before I have decided anything, because that's what a trained ear does. All along the causeway, at every gap, so is every other watchman. And in the city behind, in the dark, several thousand people are picking up weapons and going to the canoes, and nobody had to be told where to go, because the plan was made a week ago, and everyone knew their part. The city's response is fast, and it is not chaos, and I want to be precise about that, because the old tellings love the word swarm, and it's wrong. Canoes, that's the answer. Hundreds of them, then more, off the canals, and out onto the open lake on both sides of the causeway, because a causeway is a road with water on both sides, which makes it the most exposed piece of ground in the valley, if the other side owns boats. And the fighters in those canoes are not trying to board a stone road 2 feet above them into massed steel. They don't need to. They come alongside in the dark, and they use what works from a canoe. Darts, stones from slings, arrows, long spears against the ones near the edge. They come in, they strike, they slide back into the dark and the rain, and another canoe takes the place. From the causeway, all you see is black water that occasionally produces violence, and then goes quiet again. From out here, what I see is a road 2 miles long, with an enemy army standing on it, and my city arriving on both flanks in the dark, on schedule. That's not a swarm. That's a rehearsed response by people who own the terrain. And now the bridge. The one piece of engineering the entire escape depends on. They lay it across the first gap. It works. The advance party crosses. The main body starts to move, and for a couple of minutes the plan is a plan. Then everything behind them arrives at once. Because the alarm has gone up, and the rear guard is being hit, and there is no longer any such thing as an orderly column. There is a mass of men, horses, and carts, all deciding simultaneously that they need to be on the other side of that gap right now, and they all go onto one timber span in the rain. Under that weight, the bridge settles into the gap and jams. Wet timber, soft edges, thousands of pounds pressing down and forward. The men detailed to lift it cannot lift it. They try. Diaz says they tried. It never moves again. Read what that means slowly. There are more gaps ahead. Several. And the only thing they had to cross them with is now permanently stuck in the first one, with the whole army on the wrong side of the rest of the night. Everything after this is not a battle, it's a math problem with no solution, being solved by exhausted people in the dark. I want to stop the clock here for a moment, because the next part is hard and you may be drifting. And I'd rather you had the shape of it than the detail. What happens over the next couple of hours on this causeway is that several thousand people try to cross gaps in a stone road over deep water at night in the rain while being attacked from both sides, and a great many of them do not. I am not going to walk you through it. There is no version of that told at 3 in the morning that leaves you better off, and it is not what this channel is for. The record has it. The record is enough. What I'll give you instead is what the record actually emphasizes, which is quieter and stranger and truer. The gaps did not stay open. They filled with baggage, with dead horses, with cannon, with packs, with wood from anything that could be broken, and with people. And the men at the back of the column crossed the last gaps on top of what had gone into them first. Diaz writes it plainly, and he was near the back. He got across, he says, on a mass of bodies and cargo and horses that had gone in ahead of him. That's the sentence that makes this night different from a battle. Nobody won that gap. It filled. And the gold. I told you it would come back. Here it is, and it's the part of this night that has traveled 500 years without needing anyone's help to be remembered, because it explains itself. The men who had loaded themselves heaviest went in and did not come up. That's it. That's the whole mechanism. Gold is dense past most people's intuition. A man carrying a serious weight of it in his clothes and his pack and his boots cannot swim, cannot climb a wet stone edge, and cannot be pulled up by someone else standing on that edge. Several accounts say some men went into the water and were simply gone, straight down, without a struggle anyone could see. Diaz, who took a few small pieces and lived, is grimly clear about who it was. It was disproportionately the newcomers, the ones who had joined weeks earlier and had no idea what this valley did to people. who took the most and drowned for it. I've got no sermon for you. Watchmen don't sermonize. We log, so log it exactly as it stands, and let it be as loud as it wants to be at this hour. There were men on that causeway who could have lived and chose the weight instead, and the lake did not negotiate. One more thing from this stretch, and then the hours turn. There's a famous story about tonight. Pedro de Alvarado, the man who ordered the killing at the festival in May, the man commanding the rear guard tonight, is supposed to have come to a gap too wide to cross, planted his lance in the bottom, and vaulted it. They call it Alvarado's Leap. There's a place named for it. It's in the paintings. Bernal Diaz was on this causeway that night, and Diaz says he doesn't believe it. He says the gap was too wide, the water too deep for a lance to find bottom, and that men who were there told it differently. So we do what we always do with a good story that the eyewitness rejects. We tell you it exists, we tell you who doubts it and why, and we don't spend it as if it were true. I'll say this much for it. As a piece of folklore, though, of all the men on this causeway tonight, the one the legend chose to make into an acrobat is the one whose actions in May made the whole night inevitable. There's something almost funny in that. In a bleak way, history gave him a stunt and called it even. Fourth watch coming, friend, and the rain hasn't let up. The worst of the night is behind us in the telling. Stay under the blanket. They reach the mainland before light. Not all of them, enough of them. The head of the column gets off the causeway at Tlacopan, which is a town on the western shore, and pieces of the rest keep arriving behind it for a long time, in ones and twos and small exhausted groups. Some men are still on the causeway at first light. Some never came off it at all. And here is the thing that nobody who tells this story quickly ever mentions, so I'll be the one. The city did not pursue them off the causeway and finish them. It could have. There were canoes, there were thousands of fighters, and there was a broken, soaked, half-drowned army standing on a shoreline at dawn with no order left in it. Why not? Historians have argued it for centuries, and the honest answer is that we don't know. There are reasonable readings that the immediate objective, getting them out of the city, had been achieved, that there were rights owed to the dead and the captured that took precedence, that a night action across water doesn't convert cleanly into a dawn pursuit inland, that the city had its own casualties and its own mourning. I've got no verdict. I've got a fact. They were let go. And within a year, that mattered enormously. Now, the counting. And I want to take this slowly, because how a thing gets counted tells you who was doing the counting. Cortes writes his report to the King of Spain and says he lost 154 Spaniards. Bernal Diaz, who marched in the column, says the number was around 450. Other writers, later, working from other survivors, go higher still. One figure in circulation is over 1,000, which is almost certainly more Spaniards than were on the causeway. Look at the shape of that spread. The man who has to explain the night to a monarch who could ruin him reports the smallest figure. The soldier riding in old age with nothing left to protect reports 3 times as many. You don't need to accuse anyone of anything to notice which way the incentives point. The watch logs the range and names the reason it's a range. This is a count made by the losing side, in the dark, on a road, about people who mostly went into water. Nobody was ever going to get a clean number. Somewhere between 1/3 and half of the Spanish force did not come off that causeway. And now the number that makes me angry, which I warned you about hours ago. The Tlaxcalans. They were the largest part of that column. They had come into this valley as allies of the Spanish against a power they'd been fighting for generations, which was their own decision made in their own interest. And they were on that causeway in the rain with everyone else, and they died there in the dark with everyone else. The estimates run from about 1,000 to about 4,000 killed or taken. Look at that spread. It's a factor of 4. Nobody knows within 400% how many indigenous allies died on this causeway, because the people writing the reports were counting the men who spoke their language and estimating everybody else. That's not a conspiracy. It's something more ordinary and more corrosive. They simply weren't the point to the men holding the pens. So there is no roll, no muster list, no careful reckoning. There's a shrug with a range attached. I can't fix that. 500 years out, standing on a bridge post. What a watch can do is refuse to pass the shrug along. So say it once, clearly, into the dark. The largest group of people who died on this causeway tonight are the group history didn't bother to count. Let me give you the morning, because it's the first gentle thing in hours, and you've earned it. Dawn on this lake, after rain, is one of the quietest things in the world. The cloud sits low on the water. The surface goes to pewter, and the whole valley comes up in gray and silver with the volcanoes somewhere behind the murk to the southeast. Birds work the reed beds. The garden plots stand in their rows out in the shallows, absolutely undamaged, because a war on a causeway doesn't touch a cabbage. The city wakes and starts doing what cities do after a bad night, counting its own, tending the wounded, gathering what was left on the road, and there was a great deal left on the road. Cannon, packs, armor, horses, and gold, most of which went into the lake and stayed there. And out here on my stretch of stone, The sun comes up on a causeway with a gap in it and a jammed timber bridge nobody will ever lift, and water that's already flat and ordinary again. That's the thing about water, friend. It doesn't keep a record. 12 hours later, it's just the lake, doing what it did before anyone built anything. One last piece of business from that morning, and then the night's turn. There's a story that Cortes sat down under a big cypress tree at a place called Popotla on the shore and wept for what he'd lost. The tree became a landmark. People called it the Árbol de la Noche Triste, the tree of the sad night. And there was a cypress standing there for centuries that visitors went to see. I'll tell you what that story is. It's folklore. It might be true. A beaten commander sitting down and breaking is one of the most believable things in the world. But it isn't documented the way the bridge and the gold and the counting are documented, and a program that spends the night being careful about evidence shouldn't get sloppy at the end, because the image is good. And here's the more interesting fact, the modern one, which I like a great deal. Mexico has largely stopped calling this night the sad night, because Noche Triste is a name given by the people who lost, describing their own grief, and applied, ever since, to a night on which a city successfully defended itself. In 2021, the anniversary was formally marked instead as the Noche Victoriosa, the victorious night, from the city's side. You can argue about renaming. What you can't argue is that for 500 years the standard name for this night was the loser's name for it. Somebody eventually noticed. Fourth watch ends, friend. The rain stopped. Sleep on. They walked north, and it took about a week, and it was miserable in a way that doesn't make paintings. No food to speak of. Wounded men being carried or being left. Almost no powder. Most of the crossbows gone into the lake. The horses down to a handful. Moving around the northern rim of the lakes through country that belonged to people who had every reason to finish them, and who harassed them the whole way. And then, roughly a week out, in open ground near a place called Otumba, the pursuing force finally caught them properly and stood in their way in daylight and in numbers. By every reasonable measure, that should have been the end of the story. Starving, unarmed, outnumbered enormously. They won it. The accounts credit a specific action. Cortes and a few riders drove at the enemy commander's standard and brought it down. and a force organized around that standard came apart when it fell. Whatever the mechanics, the result stands. The beaten army won the field, and the road to Tlaxcala opened. I'd love to tell you the moral of that, but there isn't one. Sometimes the exhausted, ruined side wins the fight that logic says they lose. That's not inspiration. It's just variance. And it went their way at the worst possible moment for this valley. Tlaxcala took them in. That's the decision that decided the next century, and it deserves better than the sentence it usually gets. Tlaxcala is an independent nation that had held out against the Triple Alliance for generations at enormous cost. And in walks the remnant of a foreign force it had backed, beaten, half dead, having just lost thousands of Tlaxcalan sons on a causeway in the rain. They could have finished them. There were voices arguing exactly that, and the argument was strong. This alliance has cost us everything and delivered nothing. They chose to keep the alliance. They sheltered them, fed them, let them recover, and went back in with them the following year. Whatever else you think about that choice, understand it was a choice, made deliberately, by a sovereign people acting on their own read of their own interests. Not naivety, not being tricked. A calculated bet by a nation that had spent generations looking for exactly this leverage against a neighbor that had been grinding it down for as long as anyone could remember. The bet paid in the narrow sense. The empire fell. What came after was not what anyone in Tlaxcala had ordered, but that's the thing about betting on a partner who has a fleet and you don't. And while all that was being decided, the thing that actually destroyed this valley was already here, and nobody could see it. Smallpox came in with the Europeans. It was in the valley by the autumn of 1520, and it went through a population with no prior exposure, the way fire goes through a dry room. The numbers are catastrophic in a way that's difficult to hold in your head, and honest scholars give ranges rather than figures, but the shape is not in dispute. An enormous fraction of the people of this valley died within about a year, of a disease none of them had any defense against and none of them had ever seen. Cuitlahuac, the ruler the city elected during the siege, the man whose plan drove them out on the night we just watched, died of it. He had been in office somewhere around 80 days. So when the Spanish came back in 1521 with more men, more allies, and 13 boats built in pieces at Tlaxcala and carried over the mountains to be assembled on this lake, they were coming back to a city that had already lost more people to a virus than to any fighting. Call we wootens that on domags about undirt ugly. I might. Old story. I want that placed correctly, because it's the single most misunderstood fact in this whole story. The city on the water did not fall because it was outfought on that causeway. It won that night. It fell because a microbe arrived that no courage on Earth had an answer to. The siege in 1521 lasted about 3 months, and I'm going to keep it brief because it's the opposite of what this program is for, and because you already know how it ends. They cut the aqueduct. They controlled the water with the boats, which undid the whole advantage of an island. They came in along the causeways and took the city street by street, and the city fought them for every one of them, block by block, for months, under famine and disease, and did not surrender until there was essentially nothing left standing to surrender. The last ruler, Cuauhtémoc, was captured in August of 1521, trying to cross the lake. What I'll say about that defense, and then let it be, it was one of the most stubborn defenses of a city anyone has recorded anywhere. People who write about this period tend to describe the fall as if it were quick and foregone. It was neither. It took an empire's worth of allies, naval, control of a lake, a season, and a plague to take a city that had already been gutted by illness before the first boat launched. Nobody handed this valley to anyone. So let's do the honest ledger of the war, since we did the ledger of the night. The Spanish force that walked into this city in 1519 was small. It did not conquer an empire by being brave or by being better. It won because it did 3 things. It recruited the enemies the empire had made over generations. It got very lucky, at least twice, and it arrived carrying diseases that killed a staggering share of the people who would otherwise have stopped it. Take away the allies, and it fails in 1519. Take away Otumba, and it fails in 1520. Take away smallpox, and 1521 is a very different siege, and may well be a failed one. That's not me trying to take anything away from anyone. It's what the sources say when you read them all instead of only the ones written by the winners. And on the other side of the ledger, a city that detected a night escape in the rain, mobilized in minutes, executed a plan across 2 miles of water, drove out an invading army, elected a government mid-siege, and then held for 3 months against everything, while dying of a disease it had no name for. Whatever this story is, it is not the story of a people who were easy to conquer. Fifth watch ends. One left, friend, and it's the good one. It's the one where I show you what's there now. Now the good watch, and it starts with a decision that tells you everything about what came next. They built the new city on top of the old one. They didn't move. They didn't found a capital on dry ground a few miles off, which is what any sensible engineer would have advised. They cleared the rubble of Tenochtitlan and laid Mexico City directly over its street plan, put the cathedral beside the ruin of the great temple, and built the seat of a viceroyalty on an island in a lake that they had just spent 3 months proving was very difficult to hold. Why? Partly because that's what conquerors do. You sit in the chair, you don't build a new chair. But partly because the place worked. The causeways, the canals, the roads that had brought tribute in from 3 directions, all of it was there, and no amount of ideology outweighs a functioning road network. So the city continued. Different rulers, different language on top, enormous suffering underneath, and the same streets. That's the first thing to hold on to through the rest of this watch. This is not a story about a city that was destroyed. It's a story about a city that was taken and kept going and is going right now. Then they made one truly catastrophic decision, and it took 400 years to play out. They drained the lake. Not at once, in stages, over centuries, starting with the floods that kept swamping the new Spanish city because a European-style town built at lake level in a closed basin with no natural outflow floods repeatedly, forever. The Mexica had managed that with dikes and causeways and a system of water control they understood intimately. The new administration replaced management with removal, cut a channel through the mountains, get the water out of the valley entirely. It took until the 20th century to more or less finish. The lakes are essentially gone now. Where I'm standing tonight on wet stone with black water on both sides is dry land under a street. And here's the bill, which is still arriving. Mexico City sits on the dried bed of that lake, on soft clay that was holding water and now isn't, while pumping its drinking water out from underneath itself, so it sinks. Parts of the city are going down by tens of centimeters a year, which is fast enough to see in a human lifetime. Buildings tilt. The cathedral beside the old temple has needed enormous engineering work to stop it going down unevenly. The city is settling into the shape of the lake it removed. And then, in 1978, the best thing in this whole story happened. And it happened to some electrical workers. They were digging near the cathedral in the middle of downtown, doing utility work. And they hit a stone. A big one, carved. It turned out to be an 8-ton disc showing the dismembered goddess Coyolxauhqui, and it was exactly where the old accounts said the foot of the great temple should be. They stopped the work, and they dug the block. What came up is the Templo Mayor, the pyramid whose 2 shrine fires I pointed at hours ago from out on this causeway. Not all of it. The Spanish took it apart and built on the pieces. But the base, the successive layers, the offering caches, tens of thousands of objects, placed there over 2 centuries. You can walk it now. It's an open excavation and a museum in the middle of a modern capital. A block from the cathedral, a block from the National Palace, with traffic going past. "500 years of being underneath a colonial city, and it came back up because somebody needed to run a cable." Let me take you around the city as it is. Tonight. Your tonight. Because this is the part I'd want if I were you. It's the largest city in North America. Something over 20 million people in the metropolitan area, which means the valley now holds 100 times the people who lived here on the night we just watched. The main square, the Zocalo, is laid over the old ceremonial precinct. It is one of the biggest public squares in the world, and on a normal evening it is full of people doing normal things. And on holidays, it fills with a crowd you could not count. Nahuatl, the language the alarm was called in tonight, is still spoken. Well over 1 million people speak it. It's not a museum language. It's somebody's mother tongue this evening. And a good deal of it came into English through Spanish. So, you have been speaking small pieces of it your whole life. Chocolate, tomato, avocado, chili, coyote. And the food of this valley, the corn and the beans and the chilies and the chocolate that grew on and around these gardens, went out and rearranged what the entire planet eats. The city on the water lost its war and fed the world anyway. Come stand with me at the end of it, on the one piece of ground that belongs to both our knights. The causeway I've been keeping is now a street, not metaphorically, actually. The Tlacopan Causeway runs under a road in Mexico City, and the town of Tlacopan is the neighborhood of Tacuba, and you can ride the metro to it. The lake it crossed is gone, and where my bridge gap was, with black water 2 feet under the stone, there is pavement, and traffic, and people going home. Put your palm on the stone, friend, wherever the nearest old stone to you is, and think about that for a second. The gap that decided this night is under a road that people complain about the traffic on. That's not a sad ending. I want to be exact about this, because the night has a sad name and doesn't deserve it. A causeway becoming a street is what winning looks like on a long enough timeline. It means the water was managed, the city grew past its walls, and the thing that was once the most dangerous 2 miles in the valley became somewhere ordinary, that ordinary people cross without thinking. Every place we visit on this program ends up somewhere ordinary. That's the whole point of the program. The Knight's Ledger, then Watchman's Honor, lamp, burning low. An army came into a city as guests and would not leave. In May, its officers killed unarmed people at a festival. And after that, there was no version of this that ended well. The city besieged them, lost its ruler in a way we will never settle, elected another one inside a week, and cut the roads. On the last night of June, they tried to run in the rain across a causeway with one portable bridge, and the bridge jammed in the first gap, and the gaps filled. And the men who had loaded themselves with gold went into the water and did not come up. The city drove them out. It let them go for reasons nobody has ever established. They walked north, won a fight they should have lost, and were taken in by a nation making its own hard bet. Then a disease arrived that no one on this side of the ocean had ever met, and it did what no army had managed, and the city fell the following year, after 3 months of a defense that historians still underrate. And the city kept going. It is going tonight, 20 million deep, sinking gently into its own drained lake, with the old temple open to the sky beside the cathedral, and the causeway under a bus route. One last thing, and then I'll let you go. I've spent this whole night telling you a story that for 500 years was called the Sad Night. And I've been standing on the side of the people for whom it wasn't sad at all. They won it. In the rain, at night, on their own water, against everything. They won it. The name stuck anyway, because the losers wrote the books, and because there is no force on earth quite like the momentum of a name that got there first. Names do come loose eventually, though. It took 5 centuries, and it's happening now. And I find that steadying at this hour, and I'd like you to take it with you into sleep. The record can be corrected. Slowly, badly, late, incompletely, and against enormous inertia, but it can be corrected. Somebody eventually goes and looks and counts again and says the other name out loud. That's the whole trade, friend. That's what a watch is, staying awake and writing down what actually happened so that somebody a long way off can check. The old watchmen on this causeway used to say the lake would take care of the city through whatever the summer brings. They were wrong about the summer of 1520 and right about the city, and most predictions land about like that. Morning watch, and the birds are up off the reed beds that aren't there anymore. The watch is over. Sleep well, friend. I'll see you at the next gate, wherever the night needs a lantern.